The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the mixing board, its amber glow reflecting off the VU meters that sat perfectly still in the silence. It was 11:47 p.m., and Studio B looked like a forgotten chapel of sound, a sacred space where voices were transformed into something larger than themselves. The reel-to-reel tape machine hummed quietly in the corner, its large spools motionless, waiting like patient sentinels for the night's work to begin. Behind the thick glass partition, the recording booth sat empty, its foam-covered walls absorbing even the whisper of the building's ventilation system, creating a pocket of absolute acoustic isolation. This was the hour when most of the city slept, when the daytime chaos of commercial sessions and hurried overdubs gave way to something deeper, more patient, more transformative. Tonight, something was about to happen in this room that would echo through decades of American cinema and television, through documentaries that would shape public consciousness and narratives that would comfort millions. Tonight, a voice would be born. The phone call had come 3 hours earlier, cutting through the ambient hum of the studio's evening wind-down routine. Morgan Freeman, an actor in his late 30s with theater credentials and a growing reputation for dramatic intensity, needed studio time. Not for a commercial or a film project, not for the kind of quick session work that paid the bills between bigger opportunities. He wanted to work on something more fundamental, something more elusive, something that had been troubling him since his last audition 3 weeks earlier. The casting director had praised his performance, had been genuinely impressed by his stage presence and emotional range, but had mentioned almost casually that his voice, while undeniably powerful, needed more control, more authority, more of what she called natural command. The criticism stung because Freeman knew it was accurate. He could command a stage, could make audiences lean forward with his presence. But something about his vocal delivery still felt manufactured, too much like acting instead of simply being. There was a layer of performance between his authentic self and his spoken expression, and every director seemed to sense it. The engineer who answered that call was Harold Chen, a veteran of the analog era who had spent 23 years behind mixing boards, watching artists struggle with the same fundamental questions that plagued Freeman. Harold had worked with jazz legends who understood rhythm in their bones, rock stars who could make 50,000 people sing in unison, and Broadway veterans who could project their voices to the cheap seats without amplification. He had learned his craft during an era when recording was an art of precision and patience, when you couldn't just punch in a correction or fix it in post-production, when every take had to be perfect or you started over. Harold understood something that the digital generation was beginning to forget. The voice wasn't just sound waves and frequencies, wasn't just technical specifications and frequency responses. It was breath and intention, space and silence, the microscopic choices that separated performing from communicating, the difference between convincing an audience and allowing them to convince themselves. His studio had become a place where voices weren't just recorded, but discovered, where performers learned to strip away everything unnecessary until only truth remained. When Freeman arrived that night, Harold noticed immediately that this wasn't just another actor looking for a quick vocal polish or a demo reel upgrade. There was a hunger in Freeman's eyes, the kind of restless energy that suggested a man who knew he was close to something important but couldn't quite grasp it. Freeman carried himself with natural dignity, moved with the deliberate grace that would later become part of his screen persona. But when he spoke about his vocal concerns, Harold heard the frustration of someone who had spent years perfecting one aspect of his craft, only to discover that perfection wasn't enough. Harold led Freeman into the control room first, not directly into the booth. This was unusual protocol. Most actors expected to jump right into recording, to get the session moving and accomplish whatever they had come to accomplish. But Harold had developed his own methodology over the years, a patient approach that treated each session as an exploration rather than a simple recording appointment. He believed that understanding the tools was part of mastering the instrument, that the technology itself could teach lessons about communication and authenticity. He showed Freeman the reel-to-reel machine, its mechanical precision and analog warmth, explained how magnetic tape captured not just words, but the space around words, the subtle breath patterns, the microscopic hesitations and emphases that digital recording often missed or smoothed away. The tape didn't lie, Harold explained, running his fingers along the edge of a fresh reel. It captured everything, including the things you didn't know you were doing, the unconscious habits and tensions that revealed themselves only under the unforgiving scrutiny of playback. Most people think the voice is a gift, Harold said, adjusting the desk lamp so its light fell across the mixing board's array of faders and knobs, each one representing a different aspect of sound that could be shaped and refined. They think you either have it or you don't. That's Hollywood thinking, the mythology of natural talent. The truth is, the voice is trained. It's built, layer by layer, breath by breath, choice by choice, until it becomes something that can carry meaning across any distance, through any medium, to any listener. He gestured toward the booth with the reverence of someone who had witnessed countless transformations in that small, acoustically perfect space. In there, we're going to strip away everything you think you know about your voice and rebuild it from the foundation up. Not because what you have is wrong, but because what you have is incomplete. There's more waiting underneath all the technique and training and professional habits. Freeman listened with the intensity of a student who had finally found the right teacher, someone who could articulate truths he had sensed but never been able to name. Harold continued, his voice taking on the measured rhythm of someone who had explained this concept countless times, but still believed in its transformative power, still felt the excitement of sharing hard-won wisdom. The difference between a good voice and a great voice is in volume or range or even tone, Harold said, his eyes reflecting the amber light from the desk lamp. It's authority. And authority doesn't come from force or projection or any kind of vocal athletics. It comes from knowing exactly how much breath to use, exactly when to pause, exactly how much silence to leave between thoughts. Most actors fill every space with sound because they're afraid of losing the audience's attention. Master speakers understand that silence is part of the sentence, that the pause between words can be more powerful than the words themselves. This philosophy had been shaped by Harold's own journey through the music industry, through decades of watching talented performers struggle to find their authentic voice. He had seen singers with perfect pitch who couldn't move an audience, actors with impeccable technique who never convinced anyone of anything important. The breakthrough always came at the same moment, when they stopped trying to impress and started trying to communicate, when they realized that the audience wasn't listening to their voice, but through their voice to something deeper and more essential. Harold selected a simple line for the evening's work, nothing complex or emotionally charged, nothing that would require acting or interpretation or any kind of dramatic performance. Just 7 words that any English speaker could pronounce without difficulty. The story begins on a quiet morning. It was deliberately mundane, the kind of sentence that would reveal everything and hide nothing, a neutral canvas that would expose every habit, every affectation, every unconscious choice that Freeman made when he opened his mouth to speak. "We're going to record this line tonight," Harold explained, threading fresh tape through the machine with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. "Not once, not 10 times, however many times it takes until you stop acting it and start saying it." He looked up from the machine, his experienced eyes meeting Freeman's with directness that was neither harsh nor gentle, simply honest. "The difference will be obvious when it happens. To both of us. You'll hear it in the playback, and I'll see it in your posture." Freeman entered the booth, and Harold noticed how he immediately fell into what actors call performance stance. Shoulders slightly raised to support projection, chest expanded for breath control, chin positioned for optimal vocal resonance. These were habits developed over years of theater work, automatic responses to being in front of a microphone that had been drilled into him through countless voice and speech classes. Harold made a mental note to address each of these physical patterns as the night progressed, understanding that the body and voice were inseparable instruments. The booth itself was a marvel of acoustic engineering, when studios were built by craftsmen who understood sound as both science and art. The foam panels created optimal reflection and absorption, designed to make the human voice sound both intimate and powerful. The microphone hung suspended in its shock mount, waiting to translate breath and intention into magnetic patterns on tape. The first take was exactly what Harold had expected. Freeman delivered the line with professional competence, perfect diction, appropriate emphasis, every word clearly articulated and properly supported. It was the voice of someone who knew how to be heard in the back row of a theater, someone who had spent years learning to project authority and confidence. But Harold, listening through studio monitors that revealed every nuance of the performance, heard something else underneath the technical proficiency. Effort. The kind of subtle strain that came from using the voice as a tool instead of trusting it as an instrument. "Good," Harold said through the talkback system, his voice crackling slightly through the vintage speakers. "Now do it again, but this time, breathe normally. Don't prepare for the line. Don't think about projection or placement or any of the technical things they taught you in voice class. Just let the words happen." This was the beginning of Harold's methodology, gradual subtraction rather than addition, taking away layers of learned behavior to reveal what lay underneath. Take after take, Freeman repeated the same 7 words, each iteration guided by Harold's patient coaching and increasingly subtle adjustments. Drop your shoulders. Let your breath settle lower in your body. Don't think about projecting to an audience. Think about communicating with one person. Each instruction was followed by another take, another slight adjustment, another step away from performance and toward authentic expression, toward the kind of natural authority that couldn't be manufactured or forced. Around the 15th take, Freeman began to show the frustration that Harold recognized from countless similar sessions. This was normal, even necessary. Actors were used to getting direction once and nailing it on the second attempt, used to the immediate gratification of quick improvement and visible progress. This process challenged everything they thought they knew about their craft, forced them to question habits they had spent years developing and refining. "I feel like I'm getting worse, not better," Freeman admitted during a break, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone who was used to improvement being linear and obvious. Harold smiled, recognizing the complaint of every artist who had ever submitted to real training, to the kind of deep work that broke things down before building them back up. "You're not getting worse," Harold replied, checking the tape levels and making minor adjustments to the microphone position, each movement deliberate and informed by decades of experience. "You're becoming conscious of habits that were always there, but were invisible to you. That awareness feels like regression, but it's actually the first step toward mastery. Right now, you're discovering how much effort you've been using unnecessarily. Once we eliminate that effort, what's left will be much more powerful." The session continued deep into the night, past midnight, past the time when most of the city had settled into sleep. Harold watched the VU meters dance with each attempt, monitored the subtle changes in Freeman's breathing pattern, noted the gradual relaxation in his posture as muscle memory gave way to conscious choice. By the 30th take, something fundamental had shifted. Freeman was no longer trying to deliver the line correctly. He was simply saying it, trusting that the words themselves carried enough weight without additional ornamentation. "Again," Harold said, and Freeman repeated the line. This time, Harold noticed something new in the playback. Space. Not just the measured pauses between words that actors were taught to use for emphasis, but genuine silence that felt intentional rather than hesitant, comfortable rather than forced. Freeman was beginning to understand that the power of speech lay not in filling time with sound, but in controlling the rhythm of revelation, in knowing when to speak and when to allow silence to do the work. Take 47 came at 3:23 a.m., when the building had settled into complete quiet, and the only sounds were the whisper of the ventilation system and the quiet hum of electronic equipment. Freeman had been in the booth for over 3 hours, his initial performance energy long since burned away and replaced by something more sustainable, more honest. He was tired, but it was a productive tiredness, the kind that comes from intensive focus rather than mere exhaustion, from the deep work of unlearning and relearning that transforms artists at the cellular level. Harold had guided him through dozens of variations, faster, slower, with different emphasis patterns, with no emphasis at all, with attention to different words and phrases. Each take had served as a stepping stone toward something that neither man could quite define, but both recognized they were approaching. The air in the studio had taken on the electric quality that Harold associated with breakthrough moments, when technique gave way to truth and performance transformed into presence. Freeman positioned himself in front of the microphone, no longer thinking about stance or breathing technique. Those elements had become unconscious through repetition. He looked through the glass at Harold, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Freeman opened his mouth and spoke. The story begins on a quiet morning. Harold felt the hair on his arms rise, a physical response he had learned to trust after 40 years of recording. He had learned to recognize certain moments, rare instances when the technical process gave way to something transcendent, when all the equipment and expertise served something larger than itself. This was one of those moments. Freeman's voice carried the same words they had been recording all night, but everything about them had changed. The authority Harold had been seeking was suddenly there, not as a result of effort or technique, but as a natural expression of Freeman's own presence. The difference wasn't in volume or pitch or speed. It wasn't in any of the measurable qualities that audio engineers typically focused on. It was in the complete absence of self-consciousness, the total integration of thought and expression that made listeners unconsciously straighten in their chairs. Freeman wasn't trying to sound authoritative. He simply was authoritative. The line delivered itself with the kind of effortless command that suggested someone who expected to be heard not because he was loud, but because he had something worth saying. Harold let the tape run for several seconds after Freeman finished, capturing the silence that followed. The way the words seemed to continue resonating in the acoustic space of the booth, even after Freeman had stopped speaking. Then he pressed the stop button and sat back in his chair, looking at the reels as they slowly came to rest, understanding that they had just captured something that would change both of their lives. "Come listen to this," Harold finally said, his voice carrying a gravity that made Freeman immediately leave the booth and join him in the control room. Harold rewound the tape to take 47 and pressed play. The mechanical precision of the analog equipment creating a brief moment of anticipation before Freeman's voice filled the room. Through the studio monitors, Freeman's recorded words carried casual authority that seemed to transform the physical space itself, making the modest recording booth feel like a cathedral and the simple sentence feel like a profound statement. Freeman listened to himself with growing amazement, recognizing his own voice but hearing qualities in it that he had never fully accessed before, had never known were available to him. The voice on the tape possessed a weight and presence that seemed to exist independently of effort or intention, that commanded attention not through force, but through absolute authenticity. "That's it," Harold said simply, his engineer's precision unable to hide the emotion in his voice. "That's your real voice. Everything before tonight was you performing yourself. This is you being yourself." He gestured toward the speakers where Freeman's recorded words seemed to linger even after the tape had stopped, leaving an impression in the air like the afterimage of a bright light. "Do you hear the difference? You're not working anymore. You're not pushing or pulling or trying to create an effect. You're just speaking. And because you're speaking from a place of complete authenticity, every word carries weight." Freeman listened to the playback 3 more times, each listening revealing new layers of what Harold had helped him discover. His voice on that 47th take possessed all the qualities that would later become his trademark. The measured pacing that suggested deep thought, the warmth that invited intimacy, the underlying strength that commanded respect without demanding it. But beyond the technical achievement, something more profound had occurred in that studio. Freeman had discovered the difference between having a voice and finding his voice. Harold, recognizing the significance of what they had captured, carefully labeled the reel with his characteristic pencil notation: M. Freeman, 47th take, foundation session, keep forever. As dawn began to filter through the studio windows, Harold shared with Freeman the deeper principles that had guided their work. "What you learned tonight applies to everything you'll ever do as an actor," he explained, cleaning the tape heads with the methodical care of someone who understood that good equipment made good work possible. Most performers think their job is to convince the audience of something, but actually, their job is to be so authentic that the audience convinces itself. Harold had developed this understanding through decades of watching artists struggle with the same fundamental challenge: how to access their own authenticity in a medium that seemed to demand artifice. The recording studio, with its clinical precision and unforgiving playback, had taught him that audiences could detect even microscopic levels of insincerity. The legacy of that night's work would extend far beyond Freeman's individual career. The 47 takes became a metaphor for the patient work that all true artistry required, the willingness to strip away everything unnecessary until only truth remained. The story began on a quiet morning, and it continues still.